Hello, and welcome back to another video on this channel. Today, we're going to be doing another response/reaction video to something that I see on the internet. It is indeed Monday, and that's why today I'm just going to spend this time to respond to something that I saw recently on Jordan Peterson believing in God. And Jordan B. Peterson is one of the people I respect a lot. His works and his study on psychology has been really insightful, and also his discussion on Nietzsche and Dostoyevsky have always given me perhaps a new look into the situation and a new approach to Dostoyevsky and Nietzsche, and that's very interesting. And I wouldn't go too much into the background or the context of this, but Jordan B. Peterson recently published a book called Beyond Order, and also he's been struggling with some health issues for the past few months or something like that, or years. I'm not really too sure about that, but he's now on the road to recovery, and that's really good. And he's also coming out talking about these issues, and recently he did a discussion with Jonathan Pagio. Hopefully I don't butcher the name, and I don't know too much about him. I watched this video once or twice. I don't know too much about him. I did a bit of research, and he does some things relating to religious and Christian arts. But today I'm just going to watch through the video. I'll go through the entire video and stop when I want to say something. I don't expect myself to be providing too much commentary on it, but then I do when I was reading it, I did hear some interesting parts of it, some interesting things I want to respond to. So I will go ahead and do that right now.
It isn't obvious to me, and I think maybe I derived this criticism from Nietzsche, but people have asked me whether or not I believe in God, and I've answered in various ways. No, but I'm afraid he probably exists. That's one answer. Yeah, no, but I'm terrified he might exist. That would be a truthful answer to some degree. Or that I act as if God exists, which I think is, I do my best to do that. But then there's a real stumbling block there, because there's no limit to what would happen if you acted like God existed.
Okay, so I think I'll just respond to that, or just give a bit of a commentary, or just give my thoughts on it for a moment. So he basically says, well, there's a few approaches which he uses. First of all, he says, I don't believe he, I'm afraid that he does exist, something like that.
I'm afraid he probably exists.
I'm afraid he probably exists. And I think that's very true, like one of the reasons why I think people are afraid of death, or at least somewhat afraid of this issue, is because if God does exist, then it leads to a lot of weight. There's a lot of burden which comes with belief in God. It's not a lot of people, and that's something I talk in my book a bit in the book, is that, well, it's very easy to say, well, I believe that God exists, but what does that actually mean? And do you act out a life of God, or do you accept that burden? And it's one thing to claim that you're a Christian. It's one thing to say that, oh, I believe God exists, but what's the point in that? It's very easy to say some things, right? It's very easy for me to claim almost anything that I want. But you really have to ask yourselves, are you really living it as if God exists? Are you taking that burden onto your shoulders? And that's really the true thing. And if you don't take, and it gets even worse when you say, well, I believe that God exists, but then you don't take that burden on your shoulders, and then you're caught in no man's land. And that's why I say is a false Christian in my book. And of course, if you want to get that, my book, check it in the link below. Buy it from Book Depository if you're not living in USA or someplace close to the shipping, because the shipping fees would be really expensive. So get it from Book Depository. The link is going to be in the description below. But essentially, I completely agree with Dr. Peterson here, is because when you look at your psychology, or if you look at your actions, does it match your belief? A lot of times you see that there's quite a big gap there. And if you're going to claim to be a Christian, you better try your very best to make sure that your actions match up to that claim, and you really take the burden onto your shoulders. And that's why I think he develops on in the second and third categories that he says here.
That's one answer. Yeah, no, but I'm terrified he might exist. That would be a truthful answer to some degree. Or that I act as if God exists, which I think is, I do my best to do that. But then there's a real stumbling block there.
And I think when he says, and I really admire him for saying I act as if God exists, because Jordan Peterson, he's one of the few people, I think, who really recognize that even if you do not literally claim to be a theist, or you don't claim any ontological sense of a God, you do realize that we all live in a Judeo-Christian worldview, and that most of us are based on these Christian roots. and that most societies, I would go so far to say that around 90% of all of society is indeed based on Judeo-Christian roots, and I think that that's a very important thing to bear in mind. And I think that's why Jordan B. Peterson always says, well, I act as if God exists, is because we all do act as if God exists. We do live in a post, or not a post, but a result of a Christian world, and it is indeed the best way to go, to act as if God exists, because that brings forth a lot of things. And of course you may say that perhaps that it doesn't have a solid grounding, but then you go to Nietzsche and you say, what else would you do? Like, what are the opportunities, or where do you go if God is truly dead? If God is dead, Nietzsche says, well, must we not make ourselves or become gods to make ourselves worthy of it? And I think that's very true, because if God doesn't exist, then what happens to man? Man rises up the hierarchy and then becomes God, and that's a horrible, or at least in my opinion, that's a dreadful world to live in, and that's something that a lot of people fail to recognize when they're saying, well, God doesn't exist, God doesn't exist. I mean, there is real consequences, both from a philosophical, but also from a practical and reasonable sense, or psychological sense, of if God doesn't exist. You can't just say God doesn't exist, whatever, I'm going to still live as a Judeo-Christian worldview. You go, God doesn't exist, what then? And that's something that I think Jordan B. Peterson appreciates a lot, and I think that's a very good or interesting thing to keep in mind.
There's no limit to what would happen if you acted like God existed.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Because I believe that acting that out fully, I mean, maybe it's not reasonable to say to believers, you aren't sufficiently transformed for me to believe that you believe in God.
Yeah, and I'll talk more about this in a bit, but I'll just appreciate the fact that he does recognize that Christianity isn't easy, because I've talked to a lot of people, like Buddhists, I've talked to atheists, I've talked to a lot of these things, and since I'm in an international city and quite a secular society, it's been quite a pleasure talking to these people. But it's very easy for people to look at Christianity as, oh, it's the easy way out of the situation. But when you actually look at the text, if you actually look at what is at the heart of Christianity, you realize that Christianity is not the easy way out. And although it does provide relief, it does provide hope, at the same time, it also is a very difficult and a very dark thing to struggle through. And it's not just a very pure, very easy, beautiful road every day. I mean, yes, Christ is beautiful, and the story of Christ is perfect and amazing. But at the same time, the burden of Christ is very heavy, and I think Jordan B. Peterson talks about it a little later on, so I'll develop it there. But we can never overlook the difficulties and the struggles of being a Christian.
Or that you believe the story that you're telling me. You're not a sufficient, the way you live isn't a sufficient testament to the truth. And
That's
people would certainly say that, let's say, about the Catholic Church, or at least the way that it's been portrayed, is that with all the sexual corruption, for example, it's like, really, you believe that the Son of God, that Jesus Christ was the Son of God, and yet you act that way, and I'm supposed to buy your belief. And it seems to me that the church is actually quite guilty on that account, because the attempts to clean up the mess have been rather half-hearted in my estimation.
And I'll agree with that in some sense, that the Catholic Church is a very poor representation of the Christian message, and that's perhaps from my Dostoyevsky upbringing. I mean, I used to be more neutral towards the Catholic Church, but now after reading a bit of Dostoyevsky, I really find that I have more criticism of it, and that's seen in the Grand Inquisitor. I've talked about it a bit in the past, but I do think that there is some areas to improve. Not that the Catholic message itself is intrinsically flawed. I mean, I do think there's some problems there, but what I am saying is that if you look at the situation of the structure of it, the organization, the almost the country-like government-style ruling of the church, there's like the Pope and the infallibility. I think there are some problems there, and especially as Jordan Peterson, the sexual assault, and these things are indeed a very big problem, and that's why sometimes we have to separate. I think we have to separate the people from religion, because it's very difficult for us to. And at the end of the day, and since the burden is so heavy, a lot of Christians themselves fail, and it's not because they don't want to follow God. Of course, some people claim to be a Christian but aren't acting a Christian, and that's what I talk about as in the false Christian section. But also, it's very difficult, and people fail a lot, and that's why I think it's very dangerous to try to judge Christianity by by its people or by the Christians themselves. And of course, that's naturally what you do. That's naturally what humans do. But it's very difficult to judge the religion by the people following it, because no one's a perfect Christian. And I could say that for sure. Like, no one's a perfect Christian. I'm not a perfect Christian, but you do have to work towards being perfect. And unfortunately, there's this sense of stagnation within the church where people don't work towards what's perfect, and that's truly the main problem that I see. And I do agree with Jordan that there is quite a big difficulty with the church right now as it is.
And so I don't think Christians don't manifest this, and I'm including myself, I suppose, in that description, perhaps, don't manifest the transformation of attitude that would enables the outside observer to easily conclude that they believe.
Yeah. Now the way to deal with that, or the way to understand that, is that they do in a hierarchy. There's a hierarchy of manifestation of the transformation that God offers the world, and we kind of live in that hierarchy, and those above us hold us together, you would say. And so in the church, there's a testimony of the saints. There are stories. There are hundreds and hundreds of stories of people who live that out in their particular context to the limit of what it's possible to live in. And even today, there are saints, living saints, who, for example, like in the Orthodox tradition, we have this idea of what they call it, the gift of tears, or the joyful sorrow of people who live in prayer with weeping, constant weeping. And it's this kind of strange mix of joy and sadness, which kind of overwhelm them, and they live in that joy and sadness nonstop, and they pray, without end. And so that exists. But then that's one of the reasons why. That's kind of one of the reasons why, when I talk about this idea of attention, like it manifests itself in the church as well, is that you often say, and I understand it, when you say something like, I act as if God exists, or, I'm afraid to say that God exists.
Actually, before I continue listening to it, I'd like to talk about the hierarchy, because it's a very interesting thing. The hierarchy in the church, and the spiritual hierarchy as well, and the hierarchy on earth, is because, one of the main critiques that Nietzsche raises against Christianity is that it's kind of the slave morality. It's trying to get rid of the hierarchy and make everyone base, to make everyone not base, because Nietzsche isn't really arguing necessarily about the morals of the church. Not only that, but the idea that it flattens everyone out into like kind of a flatten off curve where there's no ability to rise up within the structure, right? And that's his main critique, the slave morality. It's like it's bringing everyone down, it's dragging everyone down, it's restricting people. It's well, how do you say it? It's stopping the creative spirit, the free spirit of humanity. But then, in response to that, I think you realize that that's not really the case in Christ, or especially if you read the Bible and you really focus on what the Bible really is. It's a relationship with God. It's a way of life. It's a living out. It's the embodiment of love, and it's the embodiment of truth. And yes, that truth comes with a great burden. That love comes with a great burden. It comes with a great responsibility. But at the same time, you have that responsibility, you have that burden, and it's through that where you develop yourself. And while I don't necessarily buy in with the totality of the soul-building theology, I do think that it strengthens you, it helps you grow, and through that burden of knowledge, that suffering, like what Jonathan's saying, between the suffering and the joy, that suffering brings forth great joy, and by embodying it, you're strengthened, and then you rise. It develops your creative spirit. That's why sometimes the greatest writers, some of the greatest thinkers, the greatest artists, if I may, are those who suffer the most. Like Dostoyevsky, there's a perfect example, I think, is that you see someone who suffered significantly. His children died, like 2 of his 3 children died before they reached the age of 3, and he's suffering from epileptic fits, and all this suffering, all this pain. But despite this pain, despite this suffering, he's strengthened, and it's through that his creative spirit is developed. And I think that there is a hierarchy, and that hierarchy is beautiful. It's perfect, and it's not necessarily perfect in like, it's this heaven on earth thing, because I don't think there's a heaven on earth yet. But I do think that the structure within the church, the hierarchy, is very beneficial, and it counteracts really well against Nietzsche's critique of the slave morality. And yes, I think that the slave morality has indeed developed, or the slave morality has been a part of Christianity. But that's not all of Christianity. Christianity is so much more than that. Perhaps you could say that slave morality is an impure subset of Christianity as a whole. And Nietzsche focuses on that subset, but not the entirety of Christianity as a whole. So I hope that makes sense, and I hope you understand it.
And I think it's because you think, or you tend to think, that the moral weight, like, of that is so strong that you would crumble under it, that you would just be crushed under it. And I think
believe that.
And I think that I understand that, but the first thing, that to act as if God exists, let's say it this way, to act as if God exists, the first thing that it asks of you is not a moral action. The first thing that it asks of you is attention. That's why to act as if God exists is, first of all, to worship. Like, that's, and I know people are going to hear this.
Well, then I have a terrible problem with that too at the moment, because I'm in so much pain. Like,
okay, I'll go back to this, but I wanted to talk a bit more about the moral weight. And I've developed this before, is that yes, Christianity is indeed, it has a significant moral weight, but I don't think that's the only burden as a Christian. And of course, this other burden that I'm going to talk about might tie into that moral weight as well. But recently, I've been struggling quite a lot with the fallen nature of the world and of society. Like, how do I say? I turn on Instagram or turn on socials, and I see a lot of people just living out. I don't know how to say it in the best way possible, but I look around and see society falling, you know? I mean, it's like, in the past, people had the sense of morals. They knew what was right. They had the Bible, they had the scriptures, they had the rules. But then they misused the rules, and then they went and did something else. They twisted the rules for their own purposes. And that's bad, of course. But what's happened now, I think, in society is that people have gotten rid of the rules, and instead of saying, well, I'm going to twist them, they don't even start off with them in the first place. What they've done is they say, I'm going to make a mistake, and I'm going to make that mistake good. And I guess in some ways that's what Nietzsche predicts with the death of God. When God is dead, what happens is that we naturally make ourselves God. We elevate ourselves to God, and we make ourselves our own masters. And when we do something bad, or when we how do you say, if God doesn't exist, then, and that's what Kirillov says in Demons, if God doesn't exist, then I am God. God doesn't exist for society, and hence what they do is right. And they've completely aborted themselves, or separated themselves from this original religious root. And to me, that's a very depressing thought, and that's part of the weight on my shoulders. And I think that is perhaps the greatest weight on my shoulders. The weight doesn't come from perhaps the morality of Christianity, and of course that's difficult. It's a daily struggle to live a Christian life in a moral sense. And you fail and you fail and you try again. You try, and you continue getting bringing yourself back up, pulling yourself up again. But that's not the entire picture. To me, there is more heavier burdens. And I think I will respond, or I'll provide the solution later on after I listen a bit more to it. But I think we also have to appreciate or at least understand the weight, the burden which comes with being a Christian. And it's never going to be easy. I don't think God ever says it's going to be easy on a mental or a psychological or a physical sense. The ease and the joy which comes with Christ has another root, and it's not something which you say it's going to make your life more simple. It's going to make your life more difficult. And I think Jordan talks a bit more about that later on in the video, so I'll continue watching it.
One of the things that one of these theologians discussed the idea of, and sorry, I want you let you get back to your point, but he discussed the idea of the yoke of Christ being light, and that there was joy in it. And there's a paradox there, obviously, because it's also a take up your cross and follow me sort of thing. But the fact that I've been living in constant pain makes the idea of joy seem cruel, I would say. And so, and I have no idea how to reconcile myself to that. I mean, I've reconciled myself to that by staying alive, despite it. You know, although by staying alive despite it, but there's very little worship. And it doesn't mean I'm not appreciative of what I have. I'm not only am I appreciative of what I have, I do everything I can to remind myself of it all the time. And so does my wife. I mean, she's changed quite a bit as a consequence of her struggle with cancer, you know, has become much more overtly religious, I would say. And, you know,
Okay, I think he goes on about talking a bit more about that, but here I'd like to give my thoughts about the solution to this weight and the solution to the paradox he raises. Like, the yoke of Christ is light, but at the same time, you take up your cross. And I think that it seems very paradoxical at first when you look at it, but I think fundamentally you see two different things. On one side, you see, well, let's have God, right? We have following God, following Christ is going to be a significant burden, as I've said before, and as Jordan has experienced that suffering, that pain. But at the same time, I think that I like to focus on what does Christ mean when the yoke is light, or is that I think that we have to look at joy as something which goes beyond the physical world, or beyond the mere society, the surroundings we are in. And I think that the joy is something more profound. It's something deeper than that. I'm not saying the suffering isn't deep, because suffering is very deep. It goes to the heart of the human existence. Human existence is full of suffering, but at the same time, you look at Dostoyevsky, and I think his answer is, well, yes, the suffering is immense, but at the same time, the joy comes from Christ, and it's that the idea that the beauty of Christ is so much greater, and not in the sense that it's like the beauty of Christ is so much greater, so much more simple, and so much more profound and deep, that despite the significant suffering, that rejoicement and understanding of Christ, of the beauty of Christ, is what makes it worthwhile, and that's where you derive the joy from. And it's something that I've experienced, you know. It's especially when I've traveled to places like Uganda and Kenya, and I've been to Uganda, I've been to Kenya, and I've also been to some more developed countries. Like, I mean, I live in a developed country, but also I've been to US, New York, and United Kingdoms, and Britain, and Scotland, and things like that, and France, and Australia, and I see a very significant difference between the two approaches. You know, you have on one side, in the first world countries, it's a focus on pleasure, it's a focus on happiness, but then with the people who I meet in Uganda, they seem to have a deeper sense of joy, or a deeper sense of satisfaction, and I'm not saying it's always because of God, but I think that belief in God plays a significant role in their joy, or in their, in their appreciation of life. And I have emails and I'm in email correspondence with someone in Uganda, and I wouldn't give too much details about that, because I mean, it's just private correspondence, right? But there's something which is a similar theme throughout his emails, and that's the idea of love and the peace and the beauty of Christ. And despite the times that where sometimes he's struggling to put food on the table, or during COVID he lost a lot of his income, right? Despite all of that, the joy which he comes from Christ, the beauty which he derives from the Christian message is so much greater. And while as a numerical quantity, that beauty and joy is significantly less than all the suffering. And I did talk about that in my last video of what order should you read Dostoyevsky. And I was saying that, well, suffering in this world is so much greater than the number of beauty in this world. What I'm saying is that, well, if you look at the beauty, you realize that beauty is sufficient to cover all the suffering in this world. And that's something that I've only appreciated very recently when I was reading it. It's like despite the times when I'm struggling with the burden of the world, and the burden of morality and these things, and the sadness, right, and the suffering, it's like sometimes I'm reading a book, and I read that book, and that book is beautiful, or that page is beautiful, and the beauty of that page or that sentence is sufficient to make my day, I've been getting into photography recently. I've been taking a few pictures of some flowers. And it's just that, like, that picture of the flower itself is sufficient to make you smile and make you happy, right? And I think that's like the appreciation of the beauty. And if a flower itself could be sufficient to make your day or make your week or just make your afternoon worthwhile, or reading that book, how much more so is the beauty of Christ? And I think that's what Dostoyevsky tries to raise in The Idiot. And that's his, like, well, Mushkin, it's such a beautiful story. And that's God, right? God's forgiving you no matter what you do. Nastasia, we're Nastasia. We're falling from God. We're rejecting God. But no matter how we do, how many times we run away, God, as Mushkin, is still reaching out his hand. He's saying, come on, take my hand, and I'm going to forgive you, and I'm going to make you whole. Not in the physical sense, but his beauty is going to embrace you. And I think that's perhaps a response to suffering. And of course, it's very difficult to deal with suffering because that's a very personal struggle, and it's not necessarily a logical struggle. Not in the sense of, oh, it's a stupid struggle, but it's not necessarily a logical struggle that you're dealing with when it comes to personal suffering. It's more like, well, my suffering is immense, but how am I going to deal with it? Or let's look at the beauty as well. And if you could find it in yourself, or if you could understand how, or you could bring yourself to appreciate the beauty of Christ, I think that overcomes a lot of the suffering and the pain. It's not to say the pain will go away, but it finds you a way to deal with it, and it finds you, or it provides you a way to overcome it. And I hope that helps.
Say grace before our meal in the evening. And
okay, I'm going to go back. So it's like a complete sentence.
Of what I have, I'm not only am I appreciative of what I have, I do everything I can to remind myself of it all the time, and so does my wife. I mean, she's changed quite a bit as a consequence of her struggle with cancer. Has become much more overtly religious, I would say. And we say grace before our meal in the evening, and it's a very serious enterprise, and it always centers around gratitude, for the ridiculous volume of blessings that have been showered down upon us at a volume that's really quite incomprehensible. But despite that, despite that, I'm struggling with this because I don't know how to reconcile myself to the fact of constant pain.
Yeah.
And I feel that it's unjust, which is halfway to being resentful, which is not a good outcome.
No.
And I'll like to perhaps give another response about the unjust thing, and before I go on and listen to what Jonathan says about it. But I do understand it. Sometimes you look at life, and you say, well, why me? Why have I been chosen in some sense? Why is it me that I have to bear this burden? And that's something that Tolkien, I think, says very well, very beautifully. And I say this phrase quite a lot on this channel, but it's basically J.R.R. Tolkien says, well, what does J.R.R. Tolkien say? He says, I wish we never lived to see this time, but don't we all? All we can do is all we can decide to do is what to do with the time that is given to us. And that's essentially, I think, the core of the issue. Sometimes it's very easy to say, well, it's unjust. And I do get it. It feels unjust a lot of the times. I think that's a struggle that we all face. Like, why me? Like, why did God give this burden to me? But I think at the same time, we see God gave us this burden because, number one, he knows that we can deal with it, given the strength that if we rely on God. And number two is that what we're struggling in this world is not the whole picture. There is an eternal life waiting for us, and that eternal life is going to make it worthwhile. But I think the final way to look at it is to really think, well, is it truly unjust? And I'm not saying you deserve it per se, but at the same time, I would perhaps say that you don't deserve it the other way. And what I'm saying here is that it's not like humans deserve suffering, but it's not that humans deserve joy as well at the same time. And what I'm saying is that, and that's part of my theodicy of merit, it's saying, well, humans were born before they could do anything. And what I mean is that before humans could do anything to deserve anything, humans were given the gift of life. And that's one of the greatest gifts of all. Humans were given the greatest gift before they did anything to deserve it. And And what you realize is that everything upon that, and when humans were given the gift of life, all humans is done to have rebelled against God. So you see, God gives us something that we haven't deserved, and despite that, we still spit in his face and argue against it. It's like Mushkin reaching out to Nastasia, and it's like, I'll give you salvation, I'll give you all of this without you needing to do anything. But despite that, Nastasia still runs away. But God still reaches out to us. So if we look at it from that perspective, like, how much of it do we actually deserve? And I don't know, sometimes I think about it at night and I'm like, well, maybe we do deserve some things as the image bearers of God, but we are only image bearers of God because God first gave us his image, that God first created us in his image, right? So I think it's very difficult for us to say that we don't deserve it, in the sense that we haven't deserved anything better, or at least we should appreciate what we've got, or the good that has been given to us, because we don't deserve that good. But at the same time, who are we to accept the good and not accept the bad? And that's essentially what Job says in the book of Job. He basically says that, well, the Lord gives and takes away. I mean, who are we to accept the good and not accept the bad? And I know this might seem harsh at times, but I think it's a different way to look at things, and I think it's a very helpful way to look at things. And it might not solve the emotional problem, which is a very deep problem, but I mean, if you think about it a bit more, I mean, maybe it would help lighten the burden of suffering and pain a bit, if you got what I mean.
I agree, and I can't speak, I don't know how to speak to that because I don't have that experience. I don't have that. I don't live with constant pain, and so I don't know what that would do to me. It would probably one of the reasons why it might ruin me, and so it's very difficult to answer that. I think that the answer has been the cross. Like, that's been the answer. It's maybe easy for me to just say it that way, but that's always been the answer of Christianity, which is that God went to the cross, and that God went down into death and plunged down into death, and there are mysteries hidden. And they're very well hidden, but there are mysteries hidden in that depth. But it's not. I don't think it's my job to moralize to you at this particular moment.
Yeah, I think that basically perfectly sums off the thing. And yeah, I completely agree with what Jonathan is saying. The solution to everything is indeed the cross. The solution to the problem is the beauty, the sacrifice of God. But at the same time, and I'll completely agree that I'm not here to moralize or say to Jordan, oh, you should have done this, you should have done that. Because the truth is, it is a very difficult problem, and we all face, and I'm not saying we'll all face the extent of what he's going through, but more so in the sense that we all will have, to a greater or a lesser extent, we'll all have our burdens, we'll all have that weight, that moral burden, that societal burden on our shoulders, and the burden of truth on our shoulders. And it's very easy to just talk about it from a high ground and just moralize. But the truth is, we're all in the same boat. We're all, in the sense that we're all struggling, we're all imperfect, and we're all fallen. And I don't want this to be seen as a moralizing lesson, but just me giving my thoughts on the problems of struggle, the paradoxes of the yoke of Christ being light, and also the struggle which comes with Christ. And I hope you've enjoyed this video. I wouldn't continue talking for too long. I know the video is already quite long as it stands already. So I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you do, make sure you like and subscribe to this channel for more discussion on Dostoyevsky, Nietzsche, and stuff like this, where I react to normal videos. If you want me to react to more different videos, let me know in my Discord server or in the comment section below. You can join that Discord server in the description below. You can find that you could just send me feedback, comments, video requests, discuss philosophy with other people, like-minded people there. It's a great community. Feel free to join it and talk with people there. And finally, to wrap things off, I hope you have a great day. Like always, stay safe. God bless. Have a great time with friends and family. Hope you have an amazing week, and I'll see you soon in the next Verse of the Week video on Wednesday. Thank you for watching, and goodbye.